Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about the latest main entry in the Mass Effect franchise. 5 years after its initial release, we will be talking about the infamous Mass Effect Andromeda, which is a game that I've always been higher on than the general gaming public. When I first started this channel years ago, I always wanted to make a video on why I thought Mass Effect Andromeda was underrated. And here, now near the 5-year anniversary, I finally have an excuse to talk about the game. But having just replayed it after having just also played the original trilogy once again, I've got to say that my opinion on this game has significantly dropped. I mean, there are still things I do enjoy from this game. There are things I think that this game does better than any other Mass Effect game. But I do think looking at it now, I've come to agree with a lot more of the criticisms of this game, especially under the context of this being a Mass Effect game. Now, like my other retrospectives, I will be running through the game from beginning to end, but first let's talk about some more general elements of the game first. Now, this is the first Mass Effect game not starring Commander Shepard. Instead, we have to play as one of the Ryder twins, where the one that you select ends up being the main protagonist, while the other ends up being a side character in the story. And for me, these two characters always felt pretty bland. I mean, they have this generic motivation of wanting to prove themselves and live up to their father's legacy, and for most of the game, I never really connected to either of these characters. I mean, while Ryder's background is explored more in this game than Shepard's was in Mass Effect 1, I always found Shepard more likable and found his character more compelling. And I do think a lot of that has to do with how interesting the Paragon and Renegade morality system was in the original games. And that does lead to what was a really questionable decision for this game in that they got rid of that system. I mean, for me, having the Paragon Renegade system felt integral to the series and part of its identity, but for them to just toss it out here in favor of a way more boring dialogue system is one of the biggest missteps that this game makes, where instead of having Paragon and Renegade options on the wheel, we instead get 4 different types of responses: emotional, logical, professional, and casual. Now, all of these don't matter, as for the most part, none of these actually end up affecting the way that the story plays out and are really just there for the sake of it. The conversations in this game never really interested me as much as they did in the original trilogy, and while part of that is due to the characters in this game not being as interesting and the writing also being notably weaker, I do feel like having this dull dialogue system definitely played a factor into that as well. Now, I get that they were trying to make the decisions more nuanced and not as black and white, as again, the Paragon and Renegade system is essentially saying, yeah, this one's good, this one's bad. But the way that the system is handled here just makes dialogue options feel pointless. Now, as the name implies, the setting of this game is the Andromeda galaxy, which you navigate through your ship called the Tempest, which similarly acts as a hub for the game in a similar way to how the Normandy did in the original game. Though here, you can freely navigate the floors of the ship without loading screens, though the ship itself does feel a lot more compact than the Normandy, which kind of counteracts the point of no loading screens, where through having those separate sections on the Normandy, it felt grander in scale than the Tempest here, which does feel relatively small. Now here you can also interact with your crew, again in a similar way to previous games, though not as interesting. But again, at least they attempted to recreate the magic that they had in Mass Effect 2, where, again, in that game, talking to your crew in the Normandy was such an integral part of that game. But here, again, the writing just isn't there to make it feel as interesting. We do obviously get the return of romances and loyalty missions that do give you greater insight on the individual characters within the game. Though again, it does feel like they were added for the sake of it. I mean, yes, these do lead to some of the better side missions in the game, but they don't end up amounting to much, especially within the context of the main story. Again, like going back to Mass Effect 2, the loyalty missions in particular would have a major influence over who lives and who dies by the end of that game, while here it's simply just there. And also, again, involve less interesting characters that do make this feel like a lesser version of previous entries in the series. Now let's expand on exploration, where in this game it is handled differently from how it was handled in Mass Effects 2 and 3, and is more so similar to the way it was handled in Mass Effect 1, where in this game the major planets that you can explore end up being open world environments that you can travel around in the Nomad, an all-terrain vehicle that functions similarly to the Mako from Mass Effect 1, which were my least favorite sections in that game, but I do feel like the Nomad is slightly better. I mean, it still controls pretty clunkily, but I mean, it's better than the Mako, so at least that's something. And in general, I did enjoy the side content that revolves around exploring the planets a lot more in this game than in Mass Effect 1. I did enjoy the process of increasing a planet's viability levels to allow for the creation of outposts. I mean, while this did get repetitive, it was at least something new that they added to this game. And in general, I did enjoy the side content within this game. I mean, to be honest, more than I enjoyed the main campaign at points. And I do feel like the playthrough of this game that I enjoyed the most was the one where I did go for 100% completion. While every time that I end up playing just straight through the story, the game kind of ends up boring me. And now let's talk about the combat, which to me was the biggest improvement from previous entries in the series. I mean, the combat in the Mass Effect series has always felt like a clunky third-person shooter that did get better after every entry, but still felt unpolished. To me, Mass Effect Andromeda's was a pretty large improvement here. I mean, movement felt a lot more fluid, and with the addition of the jetpack, it allowed for faster travel and made combat a bit more dynamic. Unlike previous installments where you can freeze time to use skills, the entire combat is in real time here, which I can see the pros and cons of. I mean, yes, it does reduce RPG elements in the middle of combat, but I do think it allowed for faster paced combat, which I do think as a whole is a pro. And to go along with that, the cover system returns to being automatic, which I've hated in games. I still don't like it here, but it does fit with the overall pace of the combat. The combat areas are typically larger and more open in this game from previous installments that allow for different approaches. Skills are again used in real time, with the skills that you use being a lot more varied than in previous games, where in previous installments you would have to select a class, and through that you would already be limited on what skills you can equip. Here, skills function in the opposite way, where you can select varying types of skills, and through what skills you equip, you unlock a profile that gives you bonuses. And I did like how this game also allows you to play around with your skill points, where you can try out numerous combinations and reallocate them at any time, which was a fun change to how character customization works in this game. And overall, I will say that these changes that were made to the combat system are really the only net positive over the course of this entire game from previous entries in the series. Now, before moving on, I do feel like I should also mention this game's glitchiness, where at launch this game was notoriously filled with bugs and performed pretty poorly and had some really wonky animations. And I will say, having played it on the latest patch more recently, it's still not great. I mean, animations are still really stiff, frame rate drops are pretty frequent. So really, all these years later and after numerous patches, the game still does feel really unpolished here. That's pretty much all I have to say about the gameplay. It's now time to talk about the narrative, which as a whole is a massive disappointment to me. I mean, as the continuation of the Mass Effect series, I do think it really lacks a lot of what made Mass Effect special from a story standpoint. Now, the initial premise of the story could have been interesting, of having Ryder be a part of this colony sent out to Andromeda before the events of Mass Effect 3, with the mission of exploring the galaxy and finding a new homeworld. And while it is a departure from Shepard having to end this threat against the galaxy from the Reapers and us having to take them down, like, I do feel like conceptually this is not a bad idea within the Mass Effect universe. It does have a lot of narrative familiarity to Star Trek in how the story is more so about exploration. And while the game does succeed in the exploration of different worlds, something that is severely lacking is the exploration of different races and new dynamics, where despite us being literally a galaxy away from the Milky Way, most of the races we encounter in this game are the same ones from the original trilogy. We still see them dealing with the same style of race relations that we've already seen. Like, it's so bizarre to me. In this new galaxy that we get to explore, we only meet 2 new races, with both of them having pretty streamlined dynamics, where, I mean, the sum of it is that the Ket are bad, the Angara are good. And with both of them being relatively boring, I mean, it definitely does lessen the impact of this theme of exploration. It also just feels very un-Mass Effect-like to have these pretty basic alien races where, again, comparing them to the Turians, the Quarians, the Solarians, the Krogans, the Asari, I mean, all of these being set up so well over the course of just Mass Effect 1. To have them just fumble the ball with these new races in this game was pretty disappointing to see, especially when all of the characters in this game that come from previously established races feel like lesser versions of characters we've already seen in the past. Another disappointment to mention is the lack of connectivity from the original trilogy. And I get that the concept of this game does make it harder to do, especially with the start of the mission taking place before Mass Effect 3. And I know they didn't want to officialize a canon ending to Mass Effect 3, but I still do find it underwhelming that they didn't find some way to add more references between the games outside of the addition of the alien races. And it really makes me question why this is even a Mass Effect game to begin with. I mean, while it obviously did help the initial sales, I do think the legacy of this game would have been stronger had it not been compared to the rest of the trilogy. But now let's run through the narrative, where we do get a pretty solid first batch of missions, though they are filled with really generic tropes, which I guess is really the entirety of the main campaign. Ryder does awaken from hibernation aboard the Ark Hyperion after it loses power, and conveniently his twin is sent into a coma for us to never see them again until the end game. We obviously get introduced to a new set of characters here. Again, we get the Ryder twins, who are pretty dull to me and just straight up aren't as strong of protagonists as Shepard. We meet their father in Alec Ryder, who's fine. I mean, he's mainly just there as a plot device, more so than an actual character. We get introduced to our first two squad mates in Cora and Liam, who somehow feel like a more boring version of Ashley and Caden, or even Miranda and Jacob. And it did feel pretty clear to me that they were trying to mimic the opening of Mass Effect 1, with the planet side mission having a lot of similarities to the first mission on Eden Prime. We also get introduced to the Cats, who are, again, this generically evil race and really just serve as fodder during the tutorial sections as something to shoot at. We do also get introduced to the first of numerous remnant vaults in the game, which had a bit of mystery early on of what do these vaults do and what are their origins, but I mean, again, it's nothing we haven't seen before in other forms of media. This section does end with Ryder's helmet being damaged, exposing him to the toxic atmosphere, and shockingly, Alec ends up giving Ryder his helmet, sacrificing himself, which again is overly cliched. But it does set up Ryder's arc over the course of the story, where Alec appoints him as humanity's pathfinder, and Ryder spends the rest of the game getting accustomed to this role and trying to live up to their father's legacy. Ryder later awakens, and we are introduced to Sam, Alec's AI, who again serves as this generic role as the protagonist's assistant or mentor over the course of this story, and ends up being this source of exposition moving forward. We then arrive at the Nexus, which is essentially the new Citadel in this game, and functions similarly as the main populated area in the game, and is also the location of the leaders of this expedition, who again just feel like a redo of the Council. But through this, we are tasked with traveling around the galaxy to find habitable planets and are assigned the Tempest, where we do meet more crew members. We get to meet the pilot in Kalojath, who certainly no joker. We meet Suvi, who pretty much feels like a redo of Trainer from Mass Effect 3. Gil Brody is the ship's mechanic and feels like a redo of Cortez. Lexi is the ship's doctor, who feels like a mix of Liara and Chakwas, and is bizarrely voiced by Natalie Dormer, who feels like a pretty big get for this game. But the most important character that we end up meeting here is Vetra, who does become a squad mate, and she is a fine character. I mean, probably one of the better ones in the game, probably a mid-tier squad mate here. I mean, she is a female Turian, which we don't see many of in the original trilogy, but for the most part, she ends up being kind of just a retread of what we've already seen with characters like Garrus from the original trilogy. After that, we start what is probably one of the longer missions in the game, in A Better Beginning, which is another mission that mostly serves as a tutorial, with it taking place on Eos, with it being our first explorable planet and us getting introduced to the Nomad. We do find another remnant vault that helps us repair the ecosystem to make the planet more habitable. allowing us to establish our first outpost, which again serves as a tutorial to this formula that we get repeated on other planets. And in general, I do also enjoy playing through the vault sections in this game, which typically involve some interesting puzzles and platforming sections. Now through this mission, we do also end up finding out the location of more vaults, become locations that we can travel to later on, but we also end up meeting two new squad mates along the way. The first being PB, an Asari loner who is probably the best character in the game for me. Again, unlike every other character, she doesn't feel like a retread of a character we've seen in the past. She does have a pretty strong introduction here. She has a fun personality and is usually the best character to give you some decent banter during your missions. You also meet Drac along the way, a Krogan veteran who is maybe my second favorite squad mate in this game. I mean, again, he's not entirely unique. He does definitely feel similar to Rex, but maybe add in an element of like Zaid. Again, he is this like typical grumpy veteran warrior figure, but I did like his presence in this game. Now, this mission does also include our first major choice in the game of whether to make our outposts for research or for military, and really doesn't matter. But again, the game really sets this up as something that'll be a major choice down the road. Afterwards, we end up encountering the cat, and after we escape, we end up visiting the planet Aya, where we encounter the Angara for the first time, who again come off as a really generic and boring race over the course of this game. It really feels like their sole purpose here is just to help us take on the cat. Now, along the way, we do get our final new squad mate in Jal, who is fine. I mean, he definitely has a similarity to Javik in Mass Effect 3, with him being like the outlier of the squad and also providing some exposition along the way, with him being obviously the only one from the Andromeda galaxy. It's also here that the game forces you to do a trivial task to prove your intentions to the Angara, but the story does pick up once again when you help the Angara rescue the Moshe, a high-ranking official within the Angara. So we infiltrate a cat facility where we do get a pretty fun mission. I mean, the mission itself is a cool set piece, and to be honest, this game does have a decent amount of those. And along the way, we do find out that the cat have been genetically modifying the Angara they've been capturing into cat, which was an interesting twist there and something that does play a factor moving forward. Afterwards, we get a boss battle against the Cardinal, which is a battle that I really remembered for some reason, yet realistically, it is a pretty bare bones boss battle that really has nothing of note here. But beyond that, we get another major choice in the game, and really probably the biggest choice in the game, though it's again mostly inconsequential moving forward. But we get the choice of whether or not to save the Angaran prisoners in the facility, and in turn, you're essentially deciding over who to side with Jal or the Moshe. But again, it doesn't end up affecting anything. Outside of if you choose to save the Angarans, the Moshe threatens to not let you into the Aya vault, only for her to then decide to let you into the Aya vault anyway. So again, it's pretty pointless. Well, again, we do eventually get to the Aya vault, where we do learn that the Ket's leader, the Archon, is searching for Meridian, which is supposedly an object that controls all the vaults. And we spend the next mission trying to hunt down the Archon, which involves us traveling to Kadara Port, which is an interesting settlement that feels like a slumsy sort of area. That leads up to us meeting Sloane Kelly, who is a mostly forgettable character. But afterwards, we do use the Nomad to find a transponder that reveals the location of the Ket flagship, which feels very convenient. Also along the way, the game also hands you two new missions that involve visiting two other planets that really lead to nothing and are really just there to simply remind the player that, like, hey, you could be doing side content. But, I mean, really, you could just continue on and go straight to the Ket flagship, where we do find out that they've captured the Solarian Ark. And this is a pretty cool set piece as well. I mean, it does have a pretty creepy tone to it. And here we do get another choice of having to decide between saving the Solarian Pathfinder or rescuing some Krogan scouts. But again, it doesn't end up mattering that much, outside of potentially needing a new Solarian Pathfinder afterwards. But we do learn that the Cat have been experimenting on all the races from the initiative, which does lead to some interesting enemy types moving forward, but again, just kind of feels like a retread of what we had with the Reapers. But either way, I mean, we do find out the location of Meridian and now have to race the Cat there. But first, we have to take a detour to the Nexus, where we find out that our twin is awake, and they don't do much. I mean, they're really just there in the med bay until the end of the game. So I really don't get why they decided to awaken them here. I mean, afterwards, we travel to the presumed location of Meridian, where it turns out to be an ancient remnant city, which is again another cool set piece, with this entire section playing similarly to a vault, and does go on for a bit long, but at the end of it we do find out that Meridian is gone, so that was obviously worth it. But afterwards, Suvi creates a plan to do some probing in order to find out where Meridian is, and that's when we get to the point of no return in the game, where we find another remnant city that looks exactly the same as the last one. But eventually we do shift control to the other twin as Hyperion gets attacked by the cat, and they end up getting captured because, I mean, what else were they going to do? But also the cat end up severing Sam from Ryder, so now Ryder has to do this on his own, which again, definitely isn't cliched at all. We then have a scene of Ryder giving a speech to his crew, which again feels very similar to what Shepard would do before the final battles in the previous Mass Effect games. But then we face off against the Ket fleet and arrive on the real Meridian, where the final battle takes place, and we get our final Nomad section in the game of us driving through the planet to get to the heart of Meridian control, where we do face off against the Archon for one last time. And really, up to this point, I haven't really talked about the Archon as the main antagonist. Again, mostly because he sucks. I mean, he's really just so bland, with him seemingly being evil for evil's sake, really being a villain with no complexity to him. Again, he mostly is just pretty bland. Again, he really just doesn't do much for me. I mean, the final boss itself is also not that great, where you don't actually directly fight the Archon, but instead fight against the remnant that he sends after you, and you have to defend your twin as they help you get to control panels that end up disconnecting the Archon from the Meridian system, and all this was kind of a lame way to end up taking him out. Again, so bizarre that you don't have a direct face-off against him at the end here, and really just feels like, again, a weird way to end this game's major conflict. But we do obviously end with a happily ever after, with the people of Hyperion now making Meridian their new home, and that wraps up that storyline. We do also get an epilogue mission where we do get to say farewell to every major character in the game, which would have been cool had I cared about the majority of them. But from a conceptual standpoint, I did like the way this game ends. We do also get a post-credit scene where the Archon's second in command is watching Meridian from afar, which I'm sure we'll see the resolution of someday. But really, again, to sum up the story of Mass Effect Andromeda, to me it is one that is so painfully generic, with mostly dull characters and so much wasted potential, that it's really a wonder that it comes from the same series as the original trilogy. While there are cool set pieces here and there, and while I do like the modified combat system, which was made more fast-paced here, I mean, the game as a whole is largely lacking in most aspects, making this feel just like a lesser version of other Mass Effect games. With the dumbed down dialogue system, the lack of important player choices, a bevy of technical issues, a mostly bland campaign that, again, really doesn't hold up to the standard that the Mass Effect series has established beforehand. So it sucks to say this, because I really did enjoy my first few playthroughs of this game back around the time that I originally played the game, but I've really come to realize that despite the few things that I do like from it, Mass Effect Andromeda is simply not a good game, and straight up should not be a Mass Effect game. I do feel like if it was just a generic sci-fi RPG, I feel like it would get a pass on a lot of its more mediocre elements, but because people keep on comparing it to the original trilogy, it really doesn't have a chance, and even beyond that, it just simply isn't that good. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on Mass Effect Andromeda 5 years after its initial release. And with that, I've now talked about the entire main series. Now, obviously, if you want to hear my thoughts on the original trilogy, go check out those videos. I will also have another Mass Effect video that I plan on making at some point. I really want to do a squad mate ranking for the original trilogy, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.